Chapter 2 C.G. Jung and the Shadow. You are by just a single urge possessed. Oh, may you never know the other. Two souls, alas, are dwelling in my breast, and neither would be severed from its brother. The one holds fast with joyous earthly lust on to the world of man with organs clinging, the other soars impassioned from the dust to realms of lofty forebears winging. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Faust. In my attempts to adequately describe the project at hand, I have already made reference to Jungian psychology, archetypal psychology, analytical psychology, and more often than these, depth psychology. Before continuing, it is therefore necessary to distinguish these core terms, which are all too often used interchangeably. The meaning of the term Jungian psychology is self-evident, but it is also quite broad. By definition, any psychological concept or practice created or even borrowed by C.G. Jung is itself Jungian. Those students and practitioners, past and present, who see themselves within this direct lineage are also Jungian, a reality that Jung at times lamented, saying, "Thank God I'm Jung and not a Jungian." Jung himself referred to his overall system of thought as analytical psychology. Because it is not nominally tied to the evolving opinions of its founder, analytical psychology might be said to be more purposeful. Like an author's final manuscript en route to the publisher, Jung had agency over the canon of analytical psychology. But although it is the official designation today, I feel that the term analytical psychology is in fact more psychiatric than psychological. Case in point, Jung's founding of his own branch of psychology is often seen as the final act in the well-documented parting of ways, both professionally and socially, between him and his mentor Sigmund Freud. Because the infamous Jung-Freud relationship is integral for a true understanding of Jung's psychology, it will be elaborated upon in more detail later on. But for my current purpose, it is enough to note that Jung's founding of the analytical branch was calculated attempt to distinguish his own practice from Freud's more famous psychoanalysis, a psychiatric and clinical technique more than a psychology as such. I have more than once in this project referred to archetypal psychology, but this too is somewhat problematic as a term. In an official capacity, archetypal psychology refers to the groundbreaking work of James Hillman, a post-Jungian psychologist whose contributions will be further explored later in this chapter. Though there was none of the bad blood associated with Jung's split from Freud, Hillman nonetheless founded archetypal psychology specifically to distinguish his system from Jung's analytical psychology. Quote, "Since my soul, my psychological constitution, differs from Freud's and from Jung's, so my psychology will be different from theirs. Each psychology is a confession, and the worth of a psychology for another person lies not in the place where he can identify with it because it satisfies his psychic needs, but where it provokes him to work out his own psychology in response. Freud and Jung are psychological masters, not that we may follow them in becoming Freudian or Jungian, but that we may follow them in becoming psychological." If not for his wishes expressed above, I might consider myself to be some degree of a Hillmanian. Even still, I feel that a terminological error has been made by designating archetypal psychology exclusively to the work of James Hillman. Instead, I contend that the term's literal meaning should take precedence, and will rather stubbornly continue to utilize archetypal psychology as a name for the general psychology of archetypes, even where it does not line up with Hillman's archetypal psychology. Finally, this brings us back to the enigmatic meaning of the term depth psychology. Unlike previous approaches discussed, Depth psychology is not directly attributed to a single founder. The term itself was coined by Eugen Bleuler, a Swiss psychiatrist like Jung, to refer to any psychology or psychiatric system which focuses on the depths of the unconscious or subconscious mind. In this sense, the psychologies of Jung, Freud, Bleuler himself, and many others are part of the larger heading of depth psychology. In popular usage, however, depth psychology has become more and more directly associated with Jungian branches of psychology. I will at times clarify my point by specifying that I am referring to Jungian depth psychology, but for the purpose of this project, the depth approach is presumed to be centrally Jungian. It would not work to simply pick one of these varying terms for use in the remainder of this dissertation. Each designation, Jungian psychology, analytical psychology, archetypal psychology, and depth psychology, has a subtly distinct meaning and a particular usage. That said, I contend that this project is, at its core, depth psychological, and so we must now shift beyond terminology to the philosophy of the depth approach. The philosophy of Jungian depth psychology. The field of depth psychology can at times feel like the Wild West of disciplines, with no rule of law and no boundaries but the horizon itself. Indeed, like the manifest destiny that sent early American settlers out across the frontier in the spirit of, "This land was made for you and me," the depth psychologist helps himself to any tools within reach and treats all the world as his sandbox. Interpreting works of literature, slips of the tongue, cultural myths, hallucinations, communal rituals, and personal dreams as pieces of a psychological puzzle. As a student of the depth approach myself, I say this not to undercut the validity of the field as a whole. Quite the contrary, I feel that Jung's influence in many ways revitalized the grounded modern psychology. Still, it is important to note how starkly the approach differs from the more delimited scope of, say, behavioral psychology. As the name so clearly indicates, the behaviorist knows precisely where her sandbox ends, which toys belong to her and which do not. To be sure, both skill and art are needed for compelling analysis, but any final interpretation must nevertheless be based on entirely observable, verifiable, and even repetitive behavior. From this perspective, one cannot blame the behaviorist for writing off depth psychology as a rather undisciplined discipline. If the rules of depth psychology are somewhat mercurial, it is because its end goal is equally so. The depth in the depth approach hints at a compelling metaphor that lives at the very heart of the field, where other psychologies diligently scan the surface of the waters of the human mind. Depth psychology wonders at the endless mysteries below, and dares to plumb the depths of the human psyche. I do not, therefore, prop up the field of behavioral psychology as a mere foil for the depth approach. Rather, the respective purviews of the two fields are in fact diametrically opposed. Where the behavioralist categorically ignores all phenomena that he holds to be unknowable or imaginary, the depth psychologist sees observable and verifiable contents as manifestations of deeper, more significant, and even more real aspects of the human experience, which can be mined for valuable insights with both personal and clinical application. It is no great surprise that the current definition of psychology, quote, "the science of mind and behavior," is far more in line with the definition of the behavioral branch than with that of depth psychology. But I feel called here to cite the well-known etymological origins of the word itself, the study of the soul, from the Greek psyche and logia. In today's world, the word soul is, of course, a loaded and extremely controversial term, so much so that it has been all but banished from not only the definition, but also the discourse of psychology as a whole. Neither Jung himself nor modern Jungians presuppose the existence of a human soul in the religious sense. But for me, the word serves as an important reminder that when set in contrast to other psychological approaches, depth psychology is in part defined by the assumption that there is something more, something deeper than our personal, physical, conscious existence. Hillman should be credited for seeing past the controversy to the vital richness of the word soul, and he fought vigorously for its reinstatement within the field of psychology. His message beautifully illustrates the depth approach. Quote, "The soul is ceaselessly talking about itself in ever-recurring motifs, in ever-new variations, like music, that this soul is immeasurably deep and can only be illuminated by insights, flashes in a vast cavern of incomprehension, and that in the realm of the soul the ego is a paltry thing." The humble place of the ego in Hillman's psychology indicates that the depth approach does not presume some manifest destiny after all. Rather, the depth psychologist views herself as a paltry thing beneath, quote, "that endless skyway." This at last helps to explain why depth psychological projects are so loose with interdisciplinary boundaries and so broad in their scope. Just as the behavioral psychologist must critically examine all observable behaviors, the depth psychologist must be open to explore any and all products of the soul, however daunting that task may be. Literature, oral tradition, ritual myth, works of art, personal dreams, neuroses, and everything in between. These are the raw data of depth psychology expressed in the universal dialect of the human soul. Jungian concepts and terminology. Though the potential scope of depth psychology as a field is almost limitless, the scope of this dissertation is not. Quite specifically, it is important here to underscore that this project is not clinical in nature. Beyond theoretical research, I have no formal training in clinical psychology. For this reason, psychiatric casework, dream analysis, and clinical terminology will be brought into this dissertation solely as a means of accurately outlining the larger context of Jungian psychology into which my foreshadow archetype will be placed. In Shadow and Self, Selected Papers in Analytical Psychology, Joseph Henderson describes not only Jung's central archetypes of the unconscious, but also the chronological narrative of how these concepts emerged and evolved in his thinking. At a glance, Henderson seems to critique Jung for being initially struck in the, quote, manner of a natural scientist, end quote. Quote, "First he described the ego, then the shadow, then the psyche, which is the anima and animus, and finally the self. All these descriptions satisfy a linear system of thinking. When the structure is turned into an image of movement, we get a sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 progression, which could be read forward or backward, but always with the ego as the initial member of this foursome." In truth, Henderson's goal here is not to discredit Jung, but rather to dissuade students from any romantic notions of analytical psychology bursting like Athena fully formed from the mind of Jung. As we will continue to see in the pages to come, even Jung's more radical ideas took seed within the conceptual garden bed put down by Freud. But Henderson's critique of Jung's linear system of thinking offers another important insight. There is nothing magical or permanent about the particular order in which Jung chooses to outline his core archetypal forms. At times he seems to be following the chronology of when he himself developed these concepts, while at other times he orders his argument in an attempt to place a particular archetype, most often the self, in a seat of greater importance. At still other times, Jung seeks only to introduce archetypal forms in an order which best promotes understanding in his readers. Said another way, as Jung further distinguished himself from Freud and developed his own voice, his thinking gained fluidity, as did his model of the human psyche. I will take advantage of this fluidity in the ordering of my own explication of Jungian terminology. There is still an unfilled niche of Jung's model of the psyche waiting, as it were, for the introduction of an unexplored archetypal presence. This presence, the foreshadow archetype, cannot be understood except through its complicated relationship with the ego and, to a much larger extent, the shadow and the self. What follows is therefore a gradual introduction to Jungian ideas, each term being necessary for an increasingly in-depth treatment of those concepts which are most central to this dissertation. From consciousness to the collective unconscious. Some Jungians claim a Procrustean distinction between Freud's subconscious and Jung's unconscious. This would indeed be a convenient differentiation were it not, alas, almost entirely contrived. Both thinkers wrote much of their work in their native tongue of German, and the translation of these works into English has at times created a false dichotomy between concepts which nonetheless began as one. Translation differences aside, the favored term for both Freudians and Jungians has been and remains the unconscious mind. We live in a world so profoundly shaped by Freud's conception of the unconscious, as opposed to the conscious mind, that this revolutionary idea has been erroneously deemed common sense. Freud did not coin the term himself, but he must certainly be credited for bringing it into popular use. We learned from Freud that we can know something without knowing it. We desire things we cannot admit even to ourselves, the words that slip out, the details we suddenly remember or conveniently forget, and all of those seemingly meaningless dreams, quote, really do possess a meaning, end quote, after all. Much will be said about the relatively meager value that Freud placed on the unconscious when compared to Jung, but Jung could not have valued the unconscious at all had not Freud first elevated it out of the realm of the purely nonsensical. Freud visualizes the unconscious mind much like the septic system of a home. Year after year we expel our unwanted bodily waste down the toilet with wads of paper. Food residue is scraped off of plates into the kitchen sink. Fallen hair, dry skin, and toenail clippings find their way down the shower drain. None of this necessarily presents a problem, so long as the pipes are in working order and the septic tank is emptied periodically. For Freud, living a high-functioning conscious life requires the unconscious as a sort of receptacle for traumatic memories, socially unacceptable behaviors, and childish wishes that do not fit one's situation, one's station in life. So long as the unconscious mind is a healthy state, conscious life will remain productive and well-adjusted. But if an ashamed child flushes a pair of underwear down the toilet, if the shower drain is blocked with knots of hair, or if a forgotten faucet overflows the septic tank, then a lifetime of dirty little secrets can seep or even erupt into conscious life for all the neighbors to see. God forbid that the family boa constrictor escapes and finds its way through the toilet into the pipes. We tell ourselves that nothing could live down there, but that does not stop the fears from growing along with the urban legend, an apt image for Freudian monsters from the id. With this view of the unconscious, it is no wonder that Freud saw his own system of psychoanalysis not only as an emergency fix in the case of a psychotic break, but also as a preventative necessity in the modern era. Unfortunately, however, this also relegates the Freudian psychoanalyst to the position of a glorified plumber, at best making an annual visit to check the pipes and clear out the septic tank, and at worst wading knee-high through human waste. But more problematic still is the fact that Freud's conception of the unconscious is almost entirely without its own creative agency. The plumber rarely strikes gold. The dramatic relationship between Jung and Freud is well documented and has itself been psychoanalyzed extensively. Though Jung was already 30 years old and quite accomplished when he first met Freud in 1906, the signs of a father-son complex were nonetheless clearly present. For a number of years, Jung seemed to have been as pleased to have a paternal mentor in Freud as Freud was to have an heir apparent in Jung. But, as is the inevitable end of any father-son complex, Jung eventually felt trapped by these preset roles, and in 1912 sought to elevate himself as a peer to Freud with his publication of Symbols of Transformation. Freud's apparently cold dismissal of Jung's variations from his theories eventually culminated, quote, in the final severance of their personal and professional connections in 1913, end quote. The very heart of this traumatic split was a fundamental disagreement concerning the nature of the unconscious. A disagreement that echoed in their divergent perspectives on dream interpretation. It is difficult to miss Jung's somewhat biting tone, even 50 years after they parted ways. Quote, these dream images were called archaic remnants by Freud. The phrase suggests that they are psychic elements surviving in the human mind from ages long ago. This point of view is characteristic of those who regard the unconscious as a mere apex of consciousness, or more picturesquely, as a trash can that collects all the refuse of the conscious mind. If Freud's concept of the unconscious is like a sewer system with dreams and repressed urges caught in the pipes, Jung's view of the unconscious is more like an ancient well, nourished by a fresh spring of creativity. Quote, dreams to a Jungian are spontaneous expressions of communications from a superior part of the mind. Dream images are not secondary, they are primary forms of reality and must not be translated into the mode of the ego. These wildly contrasting metaphors, the sewer and the well, are not simply a Jungian projection onto the Freudian school. In his 2008 introduction to Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, Richie Robertson seems to agree with this central distinction between Freud and Jung, saying, quote, the idea that some dreams, at least, may be like imaginative creations, restoring our psychic balance and helping us toward wholeness, was again left to Jung. Jung's discovery of the unconscious as a vital and real source of strength and creativity is the cornerstone of his psychology. But the concept did not stop evolving there. Jung's final break from Freud in 1913 left him in a state of extreme isolation just as the looming shadows of the First World War began to cover Europe. According to his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung was overtaken with an existential or even psychotic crisis. With his already extensive experience with Freudian psychoanalysis, Jung might easily have explained away this crisis as a sort of confrontation with his own unconscious mind. And yet, Jung found himself in a predicament. He realized that the compulsions and colorful visions that plagued him day in and day out were not, in fact, his own. With a form of ritual play, Jung began to see more and more clearly that the psychic contents of his experience could not all be traced back, as Freud so doggedly held, to events of previous days or even to repressed traumas in his youth. The symbols that flooded into his waking life were simply too sophisticated and too rooted in cultures with which he had no personal experience, or in some cases even familiarity. Right or wrong, this view of the unconscious mind flew directly in the face of Freud's conclusion that, quote, every dream turns out to be a meaningful psychical formation which can be given an identifiable place in what goes on in our waking life. From this harrowing experience, Jung coined the collective unconscious, which exists in addition to, but is distinguished from the personal unconscious. Let us build on the metaphor of the Jungian unconscious as a well. If a landowner discovers this well in the corner of her property, she would see it as her own, even though she did not dig it herself. From this personal well, she draws life-giving water, but the water does not originate in the bottom of that well. In this metaphor, the collective unconscious is the groundwater table, and the owner's well is, like the personal unconscious, simply tapping into that collective source. And this also helps to explain why Jungians are as comfortable analyzing a personal dream as a collective myth. The particular shape of the vessel drawing from the well does not in any way change the core essence of the water itself. Quote, "Dream is the personalized myth, myth the depersonalized dream. Both myth and dream are symbolic in the same general way of the dynamics of the psyche." Apart from his own rather alarming confrontation with the collective unconscious, Jung continued to see evidence for this common inheritance in myths, art, and in the dreams of his patients. The complexity of these dreams, especially those of children, was all the proof Jung needed for an unconscious that extends beyond one's personal experience. Quote, "The dreams of 3- and 4-year-old children are so strikingly mythological and so fraught with meaning that one would take them at once for the dreams of grown-ups, did not one know who the dreamer was. They are the last vestiges of a dwindling collective psyche, which dreamingly reiterates the perennial contents of the human soul." Jung's monumental step from the unconscious to the collective unconscious was nothing short of revolutionary. As already said, Freud's discovery of the unconscious mind as a complicated yet meaningful domain was no less revolutionary, and deserves both credit and admiration as the cornerstone for Jung's further advancements. Still, it is important to emphasize that Jung's conclusions were seen as a direct challenge to the Freudian school, which continues to this day holding fast to a purely personal unconscious. Indeed, it is easy to imagine Jung, after all those years, still addressing his arguments directly to Freud himself like a prodigal son who would not return after all. Quote, "The unconscious psyche of the child is truly limitless in extent of incalculable age. Behind the longing to be a child again, or behind the anxiety dreams of children, there is, with all due respect to the parents, more than the joys of the cradle or a bad upbringing." It is quite right to view the infamous rift between these two great thinkers as, in large part, an immature battle of egos, but we must also remember that at the very heart of the conflict was a genuine and seemingly irreconcilable difference of opinion over the true nature of the unconscious mind. Archetypes and archetypal images. Having introduced Jung's conception of the personal and collective unconscious, we begin the still more difficult task of adequately defining the ever-elusive archetype. From an etymological perspective, the term archetype has a clear usage and meaning. Quote, "First molded," from the Greek arche and typos. In this most literal sense, any template, cast, or mold is an archetype, whether it be for a mantelpiece bust or for a heart-shaped cookie. Plato did not himself use the term archetype, but his concept of ultimate forms might be seen as analogous. In Book 10 of the Republic, Plato's character, Socrates, demonstrates his view of the nature of beauty with an easily grasped metaphor. He begins a step-by-step proof by asking his talking mate, along with his readers, to picture a common piece of furniture. Quote, "Let us posit that any of the sets of many things you like, for instance, there are many beds and many tables, but there are only two forms of these articles, one of bed and one of table." Almost immediately, Plato shifts from the physical plane of many beds and many tables to the metaphysical plane of forms, one of bed and one of table. Plato's metaphysical view of the world goes far beyond this brief introduction and is, of course, highly sophisticated. Even still, his conception of forms is along the same lines as the more literal cookie-cutter definition of archetype. Jung's psychological usage of the word, however, is anything but cookie cutter. Quite the contrary, it seems to be a law of the psyche that the archetypes of the collective unconscious resist the conscious definition of any sort. Lest the difficulty in unpacking this multifaceted term be seen merely as a linguistic failure on my part, I point to Jung's own grappling with the concept. Quote, "No archetype can be reduced to a simple formula. It is a vessel which we can never empty and never fill. It has a potential existence only, and when it takes shape in a matter, it is no longer what it was. It persists throughout the age and requires interpretation ever anew. The archetypes are the imperishable elements of the unconscious, but they change their shape continually." End quote. After a career largely devoted to their study, Jung still struggles in defining his own term, as if it refuses to stay in one place. Even metaphorical language seems to fall short, and Jung is left grasping at meaning by way of binary opposites, neither empty nor full, ageless and new, imperishable, yet ever-changing. For this reason, our metaphor for the personal and collective unconscious, the well and the groundwater table, cannot be stretched to explain the archetype, or rather, the metaphor would complicate rather than clarify. This reinforces the perplexing assertion that archetypes, by their very nature, resist definition. But this indefinable nature of the archetype may in fact point to one metaphor which holds up under scrutiny, the story of Menelaus and his encounter with the mythical figure of Proteus. Comparing the elusive nature of Jungian archetypes to Proteus will add nothing without a sense of the story itself, and so a brief summary is needed. Homer's Odyssey begins years after the fall of Troy. During Odysseus' grueling 10-year journey back to Greece, his fellow warrior and friend Menelaus is not faring much better. The winds and currents forsake Menelaus, and he finds himself stranded on a small island. There he meets a beautiful woman who tells him that her father is Proteus, the great oracle of the sea. But she also warns Menelaus that Proteus is a wily shapeshifter, and that he will not offer prophetic wisdom willingly. That night, as Proteus emerges from the sea in the form of a seal, Menelaus grabs hold of him and does not let go, even as Proteus magically transforms into a lion, a snake, a panther, a pig, and eventually into water itself. Finally, Proteus admits defeat and offers Menelaus the secret of his destiny. How does the story of a mythical shapeshifter add to our understanding of Jungian archetypes? To be sure, Proteus is a beautiful image of the protean and undefinable nature of archetypes. But more important than this is the implied promise that if we too tirelessly wrestle with Proteus, with the enigmatic and paradoxical archetypes, and refuse to quit even when it feels hopeless and indeed meaningless, we will eventually be rewarded with a deep and quite unique understanding of these messengers of the unconscious. Perhaps it is our very attempt to pin down, categorize, literalize, and define archetypes that makes them so beyond our apprehension. Like wild animals, archetypes resist being caged in by literalism, and like nocturnal bats, they hide from the harsh light of ego consciousness. In his career-long attempt to avoid this type of ego domination of the unconscious, Hillman saw the power of words and chose his carefully. In revisualizing psychology, he favors active verbs and adjectives over stagnant nouns, even when they do not quite roll off the tongue. Personification becomes personifying. Psychology becomes psychologizing. Revision becomes revisioning. Instead of obsessively searching for some finite number of archetypes, he studies archetypal forces, images, and ideas. Hillman encourages us to wrestle with Proteus, but asks that we do so with a proper sense of awe. Quote, "Since ideas present archetypal visions, I do not ever truly have ideas. They have, hold, contain, govern me. Our wrestling with the ideas is a sacred struggle, as with an angel, our attempts to formulate a ritual activity to propitiate the angel. The emotions that ideas arouse are appropriate and authentic too, is our sense of being a victim of ideas, humiliated before their grand vision, our lifetime devotion to them, and the battles we must fight on their behalf." In remembering Dionysus, Susan Rowland echoes Hillman's near-religious reverence for the archetypal forces of the collective unconscious, saying that they are, quote, "story-generating, deathless, and endlessly creating via their images. They are gods seeking to live out their particular genre of story, known, of course, as myths." End quote. The pages that follow introduce a few of Jung's most central archetypes, a few of Proteus's many forms, in the hope that readers might wrestle alongside me, not to define the archetypes, but to understand them better. Anima, animus, and gender in Jungian psychology. For many self-identified Jungians, the anima animus archetype is a dirty little secret of the field. It may be that in an increasingly socially progressive society, Jung's traditional early 20th century gender binary system simply has no place. In my own experience, this controversial archetype has been more divisive than helpful, especially when those of us engaged in the discourse were not ourselves fully grasping some of Jung's more nuanced points. In truth, neither term, anima or animus, will play a significant role in this dissertation, but because an introduction to Jungian psychology would be incomplete without it, I will do my best to articulate Jung's conception of the anima/animus and explore how the idea might be retrofitted to a more modern gender perspective while simultaneously addressing how gender will be dealt with in the chapters ahead. As will become clear when the concepts of individuation and the self are examined in more depth, Jung viewed the human experience essentially as the lifelong journey of the psyche to gain or regain wholeness and balance. When this idea of balance is applied to gender and biological sex, we are reminded that human life begins with the combination of genetic materials from both a female and a male source. In the Jungian perspective, this indicates that regardless of what processes, biological, social, or even theological, take effect afterward, the human psyche is necessarily created with both feminine and masculine contents in balance. On a biological level, a complicated chain of reactions eventually begins, which shapes the human form into a male, a female, or an intersex person. When the child is born, the social construct of gender initiates a metaphorically similar process, all too often with psychologically devastating results. A web of cultural pressures attempts to designate the person as a woman, a man, or a non-binary gender. To be sure, an individual's self-identification of biological sex or gender can be an empowering act for the psyche, but that does not negate the cost of going against the grain. As already stated, Jungian psychology views the human psyche as essentially androgynous from its origin, but it is seldom, if ever, able to be expressed as such. An individual's biology dictates that some genes are dominant and others are recessive, leading to some traits being expressed while others are not. Human societies and cultural practices dictate that certain behaviors are accepted and others are shamed, leading to some desires being outwardly expressed while others are repressed. These two factors, biology and socialization, converge upon the psyche and keep the human soul from expressing itself in its totality. Without having even introduced sexuality into the mix, one must wonder how a psyche, which at its core is both masculine and feminine, is able to cope with living in a body of a single sex while being viewed by society as a single gender. In Jungian terms, the psyche's answer to this question is the anima/animus archetype. The anima/animus is an archetypal embodiment of all those particular qualities and desires which are, because of our biological sex and particular gender, unexpressed or repressed within the psyche. Falling back into the gender binary world in which Jung developed his psychology, this means that when a man takes on a traditionally masculine personality, his psyche compensates by manifesting the anima, an opposite gendered or contrasexual archetypal personality, from out of the unconscious. Interestingly, just as psyche comes from the Greek word for soul, anima comes from the Latin for soul. But more importantly, anima uses the feminine ending. For Jung, the anima is the unexpressed feminine soul within the psyche of a man. The reverse is the case for a woman. When a woman takes on a traditionally feminine personality, her psyche compensates by creating the animus, with the Latin masculine ending, to signify that the animus is made up of the unexpressed masculine qualities hidden within the psyche of a woman. Jung's conception of the anima/animus archetype eventually became overly structured and rigid. Jung went as far as to describe the 4 levels of anima and animus development: the instinctual Eve, the alluring Helen, the devout Virgin Mary, and the supremely wise Sapienti. The man of physical power, the man of planned action, a professor-like learned man, and the man of transcendent meaning. Had Jung simply emphasized each of these figures as emblematic of a general point on a continuous spectrum of anima/animus development, it would be easier to argue for the value of the concept as a whole. Still, I feel that I can separate out a few conceptual gems which are still applicable in the modern day. Especially when placed within the context of his own time, Jung's emphasis on seeking balance in all things, including gender, might actually be viewed as radically progressive. Returning again to Remembering Dionysus, I appreciate Roland's fair take on the role of gender in Jung's psyche. Quote, C.G. Jung was no feminist, yet despite his lack of interest in equality for women and social reform of gender, I suggest that his entire project was devoted to restoring the lost and repressed feminine to the collective psyche of Western modernity. Roland's stance is not without detractors, but I feel that it is well grounded. The androgyny of the human psyche indicates that all archetypes are androgynous, though they do not usually appear so within a gendered individual or society. In this sense, the rigidity and gender binary nature of Jung's psychology can be explained by, or even blamed on, the realities of the society within which it was developed. From the depth approach, Jung was obligated to explore the contents of the human soul, not from some essentialist perspective of how gender should or will be, but rather as it presented itself to him in the lives of his patients. Said another way, it would have been intellectually dishonest for Jung, after years of clinical experience analyzing dreams, to ignore the consistent pattern of a contrasexual personification of the soul. This at last leads me to address the quite one-sided nature of gender in this dissertation. After critiquing Jung's antiquated perspective, it may be somewhat disappointing to note that every one of the character studies that feature so prominently in the chapters ahead is focused on a male figure. But like Jung, I am obligated to explore only those instances which best embody the essence of what I have called the foreshadow archetype. To arbitrarily shoehorn in a less applicable figure for the sole purpose of lending gender equity to my theory would not only weaken my overall argument, but also disrespect the unexplored yet empowered archetypal presence which is now seeking consciousness through this work. Despite the presumed androgyny of the human psyche, the vast majority of archetypal heroes have been male for millennium after millennium. Though somewhat improved, this gender imbalance still clearly persists in the current day. With this in mind, I have little doubt that the foreshadow archetype is also, in its essence, genderless. But the world into which this archetype manifests is rarely genderless, and so the particularities of how a female example of the foreshadow archetype might present itself will be left for future studies. The ego and the ego hero. In the modern age, there is hardly any need to define the ego. Though the word itself is simply the Latin I, its psychological usage can once again be largely credited to Freud. Like so many of Freud's contributions, the ego is easily overlooked as common sense simply because of its ubiquity in our modern language and worldview. We might say that someone is egotistical, egocentric, or on an ego trip, and we forget that we are speaking in psychological terms. It is the ego that convinces us that we are the main character of some larger drama, and for each of us, the ego is that Cartesian I-ness, the seat of consciousness just behind our eyes from which we presume to view and interact with the world. Especially in the West, the ability for individuals to in any way distinguish themselves from their ego is all but non-existent. Still, our intimate familiarity with the ego should not convince us that it is, in actuality, common sense. As Henderson puts it in Shadow and Self, quote, "The ego is a concept is still far from clear, even though we all think we understand it." With his publication of The Hero with a Thousand Faces, Joseph Campbell became not only the crown jewel of the field of comparative mythology, but also a bona fide celebrity in the broadest sense. With his personal charisma and his uncanny ability to cast himself and his readers into the life of the classic hero, Campbell put mythology back into popular consciousness, for myths no longer belonged solely to the ancient Greeks, ancient Mesopotamians, or ancient Egyptians, but rather to you and me. But his greatest contribution may have been that he shed light on the hero as a Jungian archetype. As we already said of the anima/animus, the primary role of all archetypes is to encourage the individual psyche to move beyond the myopic and one-sided perspective of consciousness and progress once more toward the perfect wholeness and balance from which it came, a lifelong process which Jung called individuation. In this sense, Campbell's famous monomyth, or hero's journey, is essentially a direct parallel to the ego's journey of individuation. Hillman actually agrees with Campbell's direct equivalence between ego and hero, but he, once again, flips the script by casting it in quite a negative light. Quote, "Hercules entered the realm of the shades in order to take something, and while he was there he wrestled, he drew his sword, he slaughtered, and was confused about the reality of images. Each of us tends to be Hercules in ego when we begin to engage imaginal figures." Like Campbell, Hillman directly associates the ego and the hero, or the ego hero, and it is no coincidence that he uses Hercules, the testosterone-filled alpha male, as its representative. Instead of celebrating the hero's role in the Campbellian monomyth, Hillman chooses to focus on what he sees as a hero complex in the Western culture. Instead of exploring the necessary role of the ego in the Jungian process of individuation, he exposes a collective ego complex that plagues the collective human psyche. Along with aforementioned concepts like ego, archetype, and collective unconscious, the psychological term complex is widely used and little understood. Initially, Jung referred to the phenomenon as a, quote, feeling-toned complex, end quote, before it was, somewhat ironically, shortened to complex for simplicity's sake. But for a full understanding of the concept, both portions of Jung's term, feeling-toned and complex, need to be explored. According to Jung, an extremely complicated web of reactions and feelings can be activated from within the personal unconscious by a given situation or relationship. An all too common example, which has already been hinted at, is Jung's own father complex. As an extremely precocious and sophisticated child, it seems that Jung was unconsciously disappointed by his somewhat simple father, a Christian minister who was, quote, unable or unwilling to discuss the doubts with which his more gifted son confronted him. End quote. Because the archetypal role of the father was not adequately present in his life, an interconnected array of emotions and behaviors lay smoldering just below consciousness, waiting, as it were, for a man with the gravitas to take up the mantle of the archetypal father. When Freud expressed a desire to collaborate with the up-and-coming Jung, he had no way of anticipating the emotional minefield he was entering. In his attempts to explain how complexes are feeling-toned, Jung compares them with great effect to a leitmotif. But where Jung had Wagner's operas in mind, a contemporary example like the much-loved Star Wars franchise, widely known to be heavily and even directly influenced by Campbell and his monomyth, better carries the metaphor with a modern audience. Perhaps the most instantly recognizable leitmotif in recent history is the dark and militant theme that accompanies Lucas's antagonist, Darth Vader. These few notes perfectly demonstrate Luke's own father complex. Even before he consciously acknowledges his true parentage, the mood of the entire scene shifts along with his behavior, as if the change is instantly and unconsciously activated every time Darth Vader enters the picture. Indeed, the only difference between the father complex of Luke Skywalker and that of Jung himself is that in the fictional world, feeling tone complexes eventually reveal hidden truths, where Jung's connection to Freud was based on a projection. It is only on a psychological level that Freud was Jung's long-lost dark father. Footnote: Lucas's Darth Vader comes from the German for dark father. But how does this discussion of Jung's feeling tone complexes relate to the ego, the hero, and the respective roles within the drama of the human psyche? We already noted that Hillman sees the ego and the hero as effectively synonymous, and is flattering to neither. Roland sums up Hillman's sentiments in fittingly dark terms, saying that he, quote, saw the prime attention paid to the ego in individuation as a dangerous legacy of a hero myth, meaning that it is a vestige of a time when heroic warrior egos were necessary for survival. In a nuclear age, the building of a psyche predicated upon winning battles at any cost can be disastrous. End quote. In some respects, we might therefore think of the ego and the ego hero as the very antithesis of an archetype. Archetypes are the eternal messengers of the collective unconscious, while the ego is the often overconfident representative of our conscious life. But it is important to remember that Campbell's hero's journey does not truly begin until the ego hero leaves the comfortable world of consciousness and descends into the unknown depths of the collective unconscious. And in regard to Hillman's quite justified concerns of a collective ego-hero complex, the Campbellian hero is destined to suffer an epic defeat or even a symbolic death in the deepest and darkest point of the journey through the underworld. It is only then, after the ego's presumed place of primacy has been adequately humbled before the larger forces of this unknown world, that the hero's journey to retrieve the boon and the ego's journey of individuation can truly progress. Jungian individuation and the archetype of the self. Jung's psychology is, at its core, a psychology of balance and wholeness. As we have seen, the anima/animus archetype is created or sent by the collective unconscious to help the psyche compensate for the imbalances caused by its limited expression in a body of a particular sex and in a gendered world. Likewise, the ego is at some point called by the collective unconscious to embark on a perilous journey into unknown realms, all for the purpose of encouraging an open dialogue between the conscious, waking life of an individual and the hidden life which has been refused recognition and creative expression. Were we to similarly explore other archetypal forms, each would, in its own way, serve the same purpose. Archetypes are the limbs of the collective unconscious that guide an imbalanced psyche along the path of individuation toward an unattainable point of perfect wholeness. But for Jung, this unattainable goal of achieving perfect wholeness, it was itself an archetype, which he called the self. Quote, when we now speak of a man, we mean the indefinable whole of him, an ineffable totality which can only be formulated symbolically. I have chosen the term self to designate the totality of man, the sum total of his conscious and unconscious contents. I have chosen this term in accordance with Eastern philosophy, with which for centuries has occupied itself with the problem that arises when even the gods cease to incarnate. Jung places this archetype of the self at the very heart of his psychology. But as he makes quite clear above, he refuses to take credit for coining the term, or even for its usage in a psychological sense. It is also worth noting that though the collected works of C.G. Jung do not do so, I have chosen to capitalize the archetypal self in accordance with many other thinkers, including Ettinger, Neumann, and von Franz. Aesthetically, capitalization helps to distinguish the archetypal and almost sacred self from the everyday usage of the word self. But by capitalizing the self, this primary archetype of the collective unconscious is also distinguished from and elevated above the personal ego. Archetypes are not mere philosophical or psychological concepts. In fact, they are typically easier to picture than they are to intellectually grasp. This is most certainly true of the archetype of the self. But because the self is an embodiment of perfect wholeness, the ideal in a deeply flawed world, it is no great wonder that figural examples are few and far between. To be sure, many historical figures and fictional characters epitomize certain core elements of the archetypal self, but it seems that the human form is all but incapable of containing, or rather maintaining, the cosmic duality that is unified within the self. Direct confrontations with archetypal forces of the collective unconscious, and most particularly with the self, prove time and time again that the typical human vessel is quite simply not up to the task. This psychic reality is beautifully and tragically depicted in Ovid's Metamorphoses, when Semele, the mortal lover of Jove, naively requests to see the father of the gods in his true divine form. Quote, so Jove, in deepest sadness, now ascends to heaven's heights. He gives a sign, and mists assembled. He adds clouds and lightning mixed with gusting winds, and last the thunderbolts and flames that no one can evade. But Jove attempts to mute his force as best he can. He sets aside the bolt of fire that felled Typhoeus of 100 hands, a shaft too fierce Instead, he takes a lighter bolt, in which the Cyclops' hands had mixed less wrath, less fury, fire, and menace. Second shafts is what the gods have called such weaponry. With these in hand he visits Semele. Her mortal body can't withstand the flash of force so heavenly that nuptial gifts consumes her flesh. She is reduced to ash. Even in a somewhat muted form, the psychic power of the self is too much for the human form of Semele. As Yeats says, quote, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold." End quote. Another telling example of a human confrontation with the archetypal self comes in Book 11 of the Bhagavad Gita. The Hindu epic poem follows the noble prince Arjuna as he is consumed and led into battle by his charioteer, Lord Krishna. After a phase of confusion and fear, Arjuna asks to be bolstered by seeing Krishna, not in his disguised form, but in his Vishvarupa, or universal form. O Lord, Master of Yoga, if you think me strong enough to behold it, show me your immortal self. Krishna said, "Behold, Arjuna, a million divine forms with an infinite variety of color and shape. Behold the gods of the natural world and many more wonders never revealed before. Behold the entire cosmos turning within my body and the other things you desire to see. But these things cannot be seen by your physical eyes. Therefore I give you spiritual vision to perceive my majestic power." Arjuna replied, "I rejoice in seeing you as you have never been seen before, yet I am filled with fear by this vision of you as the abode of the universe. Please let me see you again as the shining God of gods. Though you are the embodiment of all creation, let me see you again not with 1,000 arms, but with 4, carrying the mace and discus and wearing a crown." Arjuna is no typical human being. He is a great Hindu prince being groomed for the throne by Krishna himself. Still, his human form is incapable of even witnessing the unmitigated power of the self, the very term used in this translation, without the gift of divine eyes. A direct confrontation with the archetype of the self puts the individual at imminent risk of psychic annihilation. The instant incineration of Semele is a mythological image of the very real danger of a psychotic break, like the one Jung so nearly lost himself in. But these are examples of mere confrontations with the self. And so it is no surprise that human figures capable of embodying the self are far rarer and far more special. Without a doubt, the two prime examples of figural embodiments of the self are the transcendent figures of the Buddha and Christ. Through the world religions which were founded in their names, these beings irrevocably altered the path of humanity. This godlike power to transform humanity on both the collective and individual level is quite particular to the archetype of the self. In fact, though Jung's personal religious views were never easy to pin down, he believed that the self was a, quote, God image, or at least could not be distinguished from one. End quote. As we will see in the chapters ahead, Christ and the Buddha are almost entirely unique in their ability to hold and maintain the full archetypal essence of the self in all of its paradoxical glory. For this reason, it is much more usual, though still rare, for the self to manifest in the form of a cultural symbol. Jung tells us that because it is not held back by societal roles, gender, or physical mortality as an individual is, a symbol has the ability to, quote, formulate a tremendous and dangerously decisive psychic experience, fittingly called an experience of the divine, in a way that is tolerable to our human understanding without either limiting the scope of the experience or doing damage to its overwhelming significance. End quote. In this sense, a symbol is a more stable vessel for archetypal meaning. A number of symbols of the self will be introduced throughout this study, most particularly in chapters 4 and 5, but for illustration purposes, we will here focus on a literal vessel, the Holy Grail, as an exemplary symbol of the self. There is perhaps no better metaphor for Jungian individuation than deeply mysterious Arthurian Grail quest. Whether our hero is Parzival, Gawain, Galahad, Lancelot, or another, it is important to note that the quest is not simply a series of external challenges to see who is the strongest, for the Grail Knight is presumed from the outset to be a paragon of physical excellence. Instead, it is the internal challenges of moral character, spiritual faith, and deepest compassion that ultimately determine whether the hero is worthy of the Grail. This may, in fact, be the true role of a Grail Knight like Lancelot. His undeniable courage, strength, and skill cannot reconcile his moral failings, and so the quest is left for one whose internal life and external life are in balance. However, individuation is not an event, it is a lifelong process. The internal transformation of Wolfram von Eschenbach's titular hero, Parzival, is a beautiful image of the slow and arduous work of individuation. Parzival begins his journey as a naive and somewhat brash ego hero. He is dressed like a fool, he dishonorably slays an opponent, and he behaves improperly with a married woman. It is at this early stage that Parzival first encounters a vision of the Holy Grail and the mysterious rites and rituals that accompany it. Because the true significance of this scene is fully lost on Parzival, we too will briefly put it aside. Like an unindividuated ego, our hero has not yet matured enough for a direct confrontation with the Holy Grail, an object symbol of the self. In truth, Parzival's inability to understand what he is seeing is a blessing in disguise. In his undeveloped state, the unmitigated power of the Grail would likely have been, as with Semele, too much for his fragile ego to bear. Instead, the hero awakens as if from a dream and is driven down a path of self-discovery and development so that when, years later, he is granted a second vision of the Grail, he is, body and soul, prepared for it. The extreme specificity and symbolic significance of the elaborate procession that accompanies the Grail in Eschenbach's Parzival will be analyzed in more detail in chapter 4. Still, the hero's colorful vision introduces a final aspect of Jung's archetype of the self. We have already seen that the self can manifest in transformative symbols like the Grail, or more rarely yet, as era-defining figures like Christ or the Buddha. But however the self manifests, it seems almost to emit certain patterns that Jung referred to as mandala imagery. Quote, the Sanskrit word mandala means circle in the ordinary sense of the word. In the sphere of religious practices and in psychology, it denotes circular images which are drawn, painted, modeled, or danced. Plastic structures of this kind are to be found, for instance, in Tibetan Buddhism, and as dance figures, these circular patterns occur also in dervish monasteries. As psychological phenomena, they appear spontaneously in dreams, in certain states of conflict, and in cases of schizophrenia. Very frequently, they contain a quaternity or a multiple of 4 in the form of a cross, a star, a square, an octagon, etc. End quote. Returning again to Arjuna's vision of Lord Krishna in his divine form, we see the balanced numbers in multiples of 4, quote, not 1,000 arms, but with 4, quote, 1,000,000 divine forms, 1,000 suns, described above by Jung. Additionally, images of the self, or mandala images, seem often to be what Evans Lansing Smith calls hologlyphs, or images which in a sense contain the whole existence. Quote, behold the entire cosmos turning within my body, end quote. Through an extensive study of his own, Jung began to see the mandala as almost synonymous with the archetype of the self. As an example, note how balanced numbers, quote, appear spontaneously, end quote, around the figure of Christ. As he begins his ministry, 12 apostles drop everything to come and follow him. After his death, 4 evangelists write the 4 gospels which have become canon. In the book of Revelation, despite Judas's betrayal, the foundation stones of the holy city are named after the 12, not 11, disciples, as though the balanced mandala imagery is of greater importance than any concerns for internal narrative consistency. But as John Mitchell demonstrates in How the World is Made, the story of creation according to sacred geometry, far beyond Christianity. Quote, the pattern endlessly repeats in the traditions of all nations where a great teacher, hero, or religious founder is surrounded by a group of 12 knights or holy men who divide the country around them into 12 zodiacal sections. Legendary examples include King Arthur, Charlemagne, Solomon, and the 12 tribes of Israel, Odin who led the 12 gods to Scandinavia, and Saint Finian, with the 12 scholar saints of old Ireland. Mandala imagery of this sort also appears surrounding the Buddha's great awakening beneath the Bodhi tree and encircling the mysterious Grail in Eschenbach's Parzival. In fact, almost any true manifestation of the self, whether in a human or a symbolic form, will naturally emit recognizable mandala imagery, especially during great moments of hierophany, or manifestations of the sacred. Like Jung, I will take advantage of this psychic fact and use mandala imagery as evidence for hidden symbols of the self. When scenes, locations, or even cultures are arranged in pristine symmetry and balance, concentric circles and cardinal points can be traced back to an axis mundi, the world navel, an organizing principle holding it all together, and there we are sure to find Jung's archetype of the self. The shadow archetype in psychology and literature. We have now introduced all of the core terms necessary to begin this study in earnest, save one, the shadow archetype. The full title of this dissertation, Redeeming the Shadow of the Self, a Depth Psychological Cross-Cultural Investigation of the Foreshadow Archetype, indicates that beyond anything else, this project seeks to explore the traditional understanding of the Jungian shadow and to reveal a previously unrecognized aspect of this archetype, which I call the foreshadow. Each term introduced thus far, from the unconscious to the collective unconscious, to the archetypal anima, animus, ego, and self, has been necessary for a full understanding of the shadow archetype in a conceptual sense. But a merely conceptual understanding could never do justice to the living enigma that is the shadow, and so this section will also serve as a segue to the chapters ahead, which increasingly use character studies as a window through which to view archetypal forms in their natural habitat, as it were. I therefore bring in some long-explored literary shadow figures, including Goethe's Mephistopheles, Stevenson's Mr. Hyde, and Hesse's Steppenwolf, as living and breathing illustrations for the psychological analysis of the shadow archetype that follows. In simplest terms, Jung describes the shadow as, quote, the negative side of the personality, the sum of all those unpleasant qualities we like to hide. It goes without saying that, as with the depth of depth psychology, the term shadow relates to a richly significant metaphor that is truly universal in its implication. Who does not remember lying awake at night in utter terror from a monstrous shadow cast across the ceiling? It is not enough for a parent to momentarily turn on the light, for the shadow monster simply recedes further into its lair. With young children and adults alike, it is not until we can truly acknowledge the harmless source of the shadow, moonlight over a bedpost, a tree in the wind, or perhaps even our own body, hidden under piles of blankets, that in an instant the terror subsides. In short, we only fear shadows when we do not understand them. Psychologically, the most difficult shadow to decipher is always our own. We spend much of our waking life expertly crafting and maintaining what Jungian psychology refers to as a persona, from the Greek word for a mask used in theatrical performances. If the ego is my conscious self, then the persona is made up of the clothes I choose to wear, my usual haircut, and the car that I couldn't quite afford but simply had to have anyway. On a dating website, or when introduced by a friend at a party, the persona is the crafted image that is broadcast out to the world. The shadow can therefore be viewed as the negative persona to the extent that it is made up of all those aspects of the psyche which have been consciously or unconsciously repressed from the persona. Defining the shadow in this way certainly makes it difficult to distinguish from other archetypal forms, like the anima/animus. In this most general sense, the anima/animus is a gender/sex specific aspect of the shadow archetype. The same might be said of other archetypes. As von Franz aptly puts it in Shadow and Evil in Fairy Tales, quote, everybody is everybody's shadow in fairy tales. The whole cluster of figures is compared one with another, and all the figures have a compensatory function. One must therefore use the word shadow cum grano salis. End quote. If, quote, everybody is everybody's shadow in fairy tales, it is because fairy tales are essentially windows into the realm of the collective unconscious. Like Alice in Wonderland, the fairy tale heroine or hero seems almost to float from one paradoxical situation to the next, and from one nonsensical character to another as if in a dream. As the ego hero leaves the familiar world of consciousness, it is forced to shed its usual persona, which has proven woefully inept in this shadow realm. Before we can truly explore the particularities of the shadow as an embodied archetypal figure, we must understand it in this more universal form. As Jung himself once abruptly exclaimed to a group of perhaps overly literal-minded students, quote, this is all nonsense. The shadow is simply the whole of the unconscious. End quote. Perhaps every archetype should therefore be viewed as a shadow archetype. In terms more fantastical than psychological, archetypes are messengers empowered with shadow energy for the express purpose of reminding the conscious ego of its own forgotten potential for wholeness. But this is the shadow in its most broad sense, when understood as one half of all psychic contents in a great cosmic duality. More often than this, however, Jung speaks of the shadow in its embodied form as an archetypal figure, with complicated but recognizable patterns in how it appears and behaves in psychic life. Distinct from the contrasexuality of the anima/animus, Jung identifies the shadow as a specifically same-sexed archetype, the same, that is, as the ego or ego hero in question. And because Jung was himself a man in a highly male-dominated world, this also, quite problematically, led to the shadow's usual description as male, quote, the primitive and inferior man, a kind of hostile brother, the somatic man, the adversary, is none other than the other in me. Though it was completed in 1806, over a century before Jung's psychology took shape, there is perhaps no greater illustration of the Jungian shadow archetype than Johann Wolfgangs von Goethe's eternal classic, Faust, a tragedy. What Jung refers to above as the, quote, hostile brother, end quote, and, quote, the other in me, end quote, are beautifully woven together within Goethe's most memorable line. Quote, you are by just a single urge possessed. Oh, may you never know the other. Two souls, alas, are dwelling in my breast, and either would be severed from its brother. The one holds fast with joyous earthly lust on to the world of man with organs clinging, the other soars impassioned from the dust to realms of lofty forebears winging. Goethe is dealing thematically with the inner duality of the human condition. But on a narrative level, it is interesting to note that Goethe's titular character does not fully acknowledge, at least initially, that the shadow is part of his own psyche. Instead, Dr. Faust does what any unindividuated ego must. He projects his inner shadow outward, manifesting it, in this case, as the demonic Mephistopheles who first appears in the disguised form of a small black dog. It is clear from the outset that projection is occurring when Wagner describes the innocent scene without any of the psychological baggage that his teacher levies upon it. Quote, I see a poodle, and I see it's black. Yours must have been some optical illusion. End quote. But this image also introduces a number of motifs which will recur with great consistency whenever shadow figures are discussed. Both the shadow and the foreshadow archetype have deep associations with dark tones, with the animal world, and most specifically of all, with a hairy exterior. Additional motifs associated with the shadow can be seen when Mephistopheles' animal form gives way to a human form. Quote, but what is this, I say? Could this occur in the natural way? It is real or some shadow fraud. How my poodle grows long and broad. See him hugely swell and rise. This is not a canine shape or size. It is important to note that the shadow archetype is, either literally or symbolically, a magical shapeshifter, like Proteus himself. Though it is a tragedy from a narrative standpoint, Goethe's Faust eventually proves to be an image of successful individuation. In other words, successful integration with the shadow. In Shadow and Self, Henderson analyzes the work in decidedly Jungian terms. Quote, Goethe, that most human of philosophers, also outlines a similar denouement in the process of individuation. At the end of the second part of Faust, Faust had met and transcended his problem with the anima and the shadow. He dies and is reborn as a mysterious seer, Dr. Marianus. Although Goethe was not a psychologist, he was psychological enough to recognize the end of the process of becoming could be found in a permanent sense of being. But successful individuation is by no means a foregone conclusion, and the potentially catastrophic consequences of failed integration with the other in me is chillingly depicted in Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Soon after its publication in 1886, Stevenson describes the core of the tale as a study of, quote, man's double being, which must at times come in upon and overwhelm the mind of every thinking creature. End quote. Though Stevenson's work is a beloved classic in its own right, few would argue that his main character can compare to the sophistication and depth of Goethe's Faust. Even still, we must note that Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll is more psychologically enlightened than Dr. Faust, purely in the sense that he is at all times consciously aware that the shadowy hide is a product of his own psyche. Quote, I learned to recognize the the thorough and primitive duality of man. I saw that of the two natures that contended in the field of my consciousness, even if I could rightly be said to be either, it was only because I was radically both. Like Mephistopheles, Hyde is repeatedly associated with dark tones, with the devil, and with the animal world. He is a trickster, playing ape-like tricks, and a shapeshifter, and he too is associated with long body hair. Quote, the hand which I now saw clearly enough in the yellow light of a mid-London morning, lying half shut on the bedclothes, was lean, corded, knuckly, of a dusky pallor, and thickly shaded with a swarth growth of hair. It was the hand of Edward Hyde. Even the name itself, Hyde, is surely a double allusion to the word hide, both in the sense of hidden and animal hide. According to Jung, quote, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Psychologically speaking, this is, of course, the true cause of Mr. Hyde. Jekyll's self-knowledge is admirable. He is fully aware of the Hyde side of his personality, but instead of seeking to understand and integrate with his shadow, Jekyll simply trades unconscious repression for conscious suppression. Quote, my devil had been long caged, he came out roaring. Jekyll attempts to outthink his shadow and succeeds only in making an enemy of him. Goethe's Faust and Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde have so thoroughly made their mark in the Western literary canon that neither requires a true introduction. Indeed, whether one has personally read these works or not, they have nevertheless immortalized and imprinted within the collective memory through their effect on later works. But this is not the case, at least not yet, for Hermann Hesse's complex novel Steppenwolf. Hesse's unique blend of Western and Eastern influences might well be traced to the dual German-Russian citizenship of his youth. But shortly after the close of the First World War, Hesse became a citizen of Switzerland, where he later penned Steppenwolf in 1927. Like Stevenson's work, which concludes with the reading of Jekyll's own faux journal account, the majority of Steppenwolf takes the form of the fictitious and posthumous journal of Henry Haller, fittingly titled, quote, For Madmen Only, end quote. By giving his protagonist his own initials, Hesse makes clear from the outset that the work is at least somewhat autobiographical. But although Haller is clearly the protagonist, it is intriguing to note that the titular role is instead given to Steppenwolf, Haller's inner doppelganger. And this also presents a telling trend in our survey of literary shadow figures, where Goethe titles his masterpiece after the ego hero Faust, and Stevenson crowds ego and shadow uncomfortably together in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Hesse places his shadow figure at center stage in Steppenwolf, as if Western consciousness had only then gained the psychological lexicon necessary to bring the shadow, as it were, out of the shadows. Hesse never directly mentions Stevenson or his famous work. Nevertheless, it is abundantly clear that, like Stevenson, Hesse was deeply focused on exploring, quote, man's double being. Hesse's already convoluted narrative reaches new depths when the protagonist, Haller, is handed a prophetic booklet titled, quote, Treatise on the Steppenwolf, Not for Everybody, which outlines in great detail his own dual nature. Quote, There was once a man, hairy, called the Steppenwolf. He went on two legs, wore clothes, and was a human being, but nevertheless, at the bottom of his heart, he knew all the time, or thought he knew, that he was in reality not a man, but a wolf of the steppes. Clever men might argue the point whether he truly was a wolf, whether, that is, he had changed before birth perhaps, from a wolf into a human being, or had been given the soul of a wolf, though born as a human being, or whether, on the other hand, this belief that he was a wolf was no more than a fancy or a disease of his own. More often than not, the inner relationship of Harry Haller and the Steppenwolf is just as combative, unenlightened, and unindividuated as that of Jekyll and Hyde. Within the protagonist, the man side and the wolf side are often violently opposed, as if each, quote, existed simply and solely to harm the other, and when there are two in one blood and in one soul who are at deadly enmity, then life fares ill. End quote. Further research would be required to determine just how directly Hess was influenced by Stevenson's strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. As a German-born author, however, Hess's near worship of Goethe's Faust is repeatedly and overtly seen in Steppenwolf, often through the words of his protagonist. Quote, when Faust, in a line immortalized among schoolmasters and greeted with a shudder of astonishment by the Philistines, says, quote, two souls, alas, do dwell within my breast. He had forgotten Mephisto and the crowd of other souls that he has in his breast likewise. The Steppenwolf, too, believes that he bears two souls, wolf and man, in his breast, and even so finds his breast disagreeably crammed because of them. Later, Haller finds himself in the grips of what a Jungian might call a Goethe complex. Arriving at a diner as a diner guest, Haller sees a painted portrait of his beloved Goethe, which he feels petrified him, and is sent down a neurotic rabbit hole, which eventually leads to him insulting his host, storming out, and even contemplating suicide. Comparing works like Faust, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Steppenwolf is not without complications. First and foremost, the writings of Hess did not spring up in a vacuum. As we have seen, Hess seems to have been in some fashion influenced by Stevenson's work, and both authors were deeply affected by the writings of Goethe. Hess was born into a world which had already been in part shaped by these great works, which, though highly entertaining, are as much psychological studies of the human condition as they are literary masterpieces. And this brings up another important distinction. Where Stevenson, and most especially Goethe, were pioneers of psychological thought, their works becoming for many the prima materia from which modern psychology would later be formed, Hess began his career in a world already psychologized by the likes of Freud and, of course, Jung himself. In his dissertation, titled Psychology of C.G. Jung in the Works of Hermann Hesse, Emanuel Meyer demonstrates that Hess did not simply osmose psychological concepts and vocabulary from a psychological culture. On the contrary, as Meyer says, the origin and development of some of Hesse's characters can be traced directly to the analytical sessions with Dr. J. B. Lang, a student of Jung. As his career progressed, Hess increasingly proved himself to be a rising star of his time, ultimately leading to his receiving the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1946. As such, it should be no surprise that Jungians as a whole and Jung himself made some quite direct claims about Jung's influence on Hesse's work, most specifically for Siddhartha and Steppenwolf. Meyer is quick to point out that claims of this sort must always be taken cum grano salis. Acknowledgement of Jung's direct influence need not lead to the exclusion of other influences. Nevertheless, in this introduction to Jungian psychology and the shadow archetype, Hess's more overt references to Jungian concepts and usage of Jungian terms are of particular interest. Pervading throughout the whole of Steppenwolf is a sense of extreme psychological self-analysis and self-awareness. Despite the untrustworthy and almost hallucinatory nature of the outer narrative, for instance, Harry Heller is always painfully honest with himself. Quote, "If we now pause to test the soul of the Steppenwolf, we find him distinct from the bourgeois in the higher development of his individuality, for all extreme individuation turns against itself, intent upon its own destruction. Hess's usage of uniquely Jungian terms like individuation and later the archetype of the self are not throwaways, for Hess demonstrates throughout the work his unique ability to elucidate enigmatic Jungian concepts more articulately and artfully, perhaps, than even Jung himself. Note, for example, how Hess sums up the whole of Jung's psychology in a few short lines. Quote, "I felt with a glow that I had only to snatch up my scattered images and raise my life as Harry Haller and as the Steppenwolf to the unity of one picture in order to enter myself into the world of imagination and be immortal. Was not this, then, the goal set for the progress of every human being?" End quote. When Harry Haller is brought back from the brink of suicide by a charming woman with a face, quote, "just like a boy's," end quote, Harry is asked to guess her name. "If you were a boy, I should say your name was Herman. Is your name Hermine?" End quote. Remembering again that Hess offers his own initials to his ego hero, we must wonder if there can be any more fitting image of the Anima archetype in all of literature than a protagonist projecting his author's feminized name onto a female savior figure. For the purpose of this introduction to Jungian psychology and the shadow archetype, Steppenwolf represents a beautiful culmination. Influenced as he was by the foundational literary shadow figures which came before him, Hess succeeded in adding his own treatise on the, quote, "duality of man," end quote. His personal interest in and experience with Jungian analysis manifested in the psycho-self-awareness of Steppenwolf. It was this self-awareness that in turn helped to carry the deeply intuitive themes explored by Goethe and Stevenson into the modern age, an age which is in part defined by a collective or even common sense understanding of uniquely psychological concepts, including the enigmatic shadow archetype. Conclusions concerning C.G. Jung and the shadow archetype. As we have seen, Jung's analytical psychology was at least to an extent established as an alternative or even as competition to Freud's foundational practice of psychoanalysis. As such, Jung often chose to order his general introductions to his own psychology so that they might build toward the concepts which most deeply contrasted with those of his larger-than-life rival, these being the process of individuation, the collective unconscious, and its archetypes, and more specifically still, the archetype of the self. This dissertation, however, sheds light on what I believe to be an unexplored aspect of the shadow archetype, and so this chapter ends instead with a brief look at the multifaceted ways in which the shadow archetype manifests in psychology and in literature. If archetypes resist definition by their very nature, so too do they resist categorization, numbering, and ranking. In this view, any system which purports a specific number of Jungian archetypes or presumes to raise one archetype to a place of primacy has already crystallized to such a degree that it is no longer habitable for these living messengers of the collective unconscious. Indeed, I do not contend that the shadow archetype is in any way more important than other archetypal forms. Instead, I will simply say that shadows and the shadow are almost omnipresent in Jungian psychology. As Hillman so bluntly puts it, quote, if long things are penises for Freudians, dark things are shadows for Jungians. In truth, Hillman's biting critique here is aimed in an astounding number of directions. He accuses both Freudians and Jungians of being stagnant, dogmatic, and myopic in their respective approaches. He mocks the general public for their cliched caricaturization of what are both deeply sophisticated schools of psychology. He acknowledges the nugget of truth which led to these Freudian and Jungian caricatures, two men who had in common a propensity for both revolutionary and obsessive thought. To be sure, Hillman is also poking fun at himself, one of the few depth psychologists who, like an archetype, refused to be categorized and instead largely lived out his career in that uncomfortable space between Freud and Jung. This brings us back one final time to the shattered friendship of Jung and Freud. How do we account for two of the world's foremost psychologists, men famed for their analysis of the human condition and more particularly for their courageous self-reflection, allowing a socially and professionally productive partnership to descend into a childish feud of egos and one which both men would eventually take to their deathbeds? The answer is, of course, the shadow. We have already said that the most difficult shadow to decipher is always our own, a truth that Jungian analysts Maidenbaum and Martin faced head-on in Lingering Shadows, Jungians, Freudians, and Anti-Semitism. Quote, to encounter and integrate the shadow is one of the great tasks of individuation. That does not mean the rejection of what is found, but rather the painful acceptance of his role in the making of consciousness. It is painful for us as Jungians to look squarely at the questions raised in this anthology, to see displayed so bluntly how our standard bearer's own shadow distorted his judgment and perception. But as Jung's psychology is a psychology of consciousness, by confronting his personal flaws and opening ourselves to the system, to the same hard, tireless scrutiny, we do the work of consciousness making. For the most part, the complaints that Jung levied against Freud and his system of psychoanalysis were consistent and actually quite measured. First and foremost, he felt that Freud was myopically focused on repressed sexuality and trauma in childhood as the source of adult pathological tendencies, and Freud's autocratic response to this complaint only confirmed Jung's growing suspicion that there was no room for alternative views or even collaboration with Freud. But in my view, these initial grievances eventually took a backseat to a more fundamental disagreement. Freud saw dreams as decipherable but not transformative, neuroses as diagnosable but not communicative, and the unconscious mind as complex but not creative. In all of these ways, Freud's psychology was simply untenable for Jung. In breaking from Freud, Jung eventually succeeded in founding a psychology which has at its core the belief in a transformative, communicative, and creative psyche. But I contend that Jungian psychology has, quite ironically, been left with a rather Freudian conception of the shadow archetype. Like Freud's view of a neurosis, or of the unconscious mind as a whole, the Jungian shadow is almost exclusively discussed in negative terms, as something to be overcome or perhaps painfully integrated, but almost never as an archetypal presence which deserves to be welcomed and embraced. Edinger seems to say as much in Ego and Archetype, when he argues that Freud's negative effect in this particular regard on the field as a whole can be seen today even in Jungian psychology. The symbolic image per se is granted no substantive reality. This Freudian attitude toward the unconscious is important to understand because it is shared in one form or another by practically all the schools of modern psychotherapy. No psychiatrist will deny that the urgencies of the instincts are alive and effective, but they almost all join in denying the life and reality of symbolic images in and for themselves. Perhaps Jung saw only one half of the archetypal spectrum of the shadow simply because that is where we as humans reside. As flawed beings, we are presumably incapable of immediately recognizing and embracing our shadow. But Jung's archetype of the self is equally unattainable in a practical sense, and yet it exists as an ideal for which to strive. The shadow archetype, too, can become an ideal, what Hess refers to as a, quote, sacred shadow, end quote. This ideal shadow is the archetypal presence that I have named the Foreshadow, with whom we will become more familiar in the chapters ahead.